I'm Jo Padgham.
And I'm Robin Ewing.
And we're co-conveners of the Foundation for Learning and Literacy. And we have here today Jane Caro.
And it's great to be here as well. Now, you guys have come up with 11 touchstones that are the sort of basic, the foundations of the foundation.
Exactly.
Can you take us through what some of those touchstones are?
We can. Let's start with the first one, Jo.
Yes, so we developed these 11, and we were thinking a magic 10, but the magic 10 turned into 11, because we wanted people who accessed our website and found out about us to actually really know what it is we stood for and what are the beliefs and therefore the practices that we are saying underpin our foundation. So the first one is very, very much, I think, probably the most important. And I'll just read it for you, Jane. A fair and equitable society depends on every citizen being able to read and write. Being able to read and write gives people equal access to information, employment, enjoyment, and further educational opportunities. And we unpack that a little more.
Fantastic. And so what are some of the others, Robin?
Well, the second one is about the importance of oral language as a foundation for literacy learning. And I guess one of the things that is so important about that one is that joy of talking and listening and playing with language, with rhymes and poetry, nursery rhymes, etc., so that children understand that they need to engage in meaningful dialogue together as a starting point.
So it's really about communication.
Communicating.
Getting to know what they think, what other people think, what they want, what other people want or don't want them to want.
Exactly.
That's right.
First word most kids come up with is no, because
That's right. They're very good at that.
Yes, they need to be able to say that.
And they're very good at it when they're about 15 again.
Yeah. Oh, I think some of us keep that ability all through our lives. And what are some of the others?
Well, the third and the fourth one sort of go together beautifully, and they build on that first one about a fair and equitable society. The third one is reading and writing are both pleasure and power. They allow us to participate in the real world, escape from reality, and to imagine alternative worlds. And these purposes should be at the heart of teaching children and young people to tell stories, to read and to write, which is just why we do what we do in schools. And the fourth one is just so important. Creativity and imagination matter in ongoing literacy learning.
You could almost stop with creativity and imagination matter in everything.
They do, absolutely. It's what it gives you the reason to be when you feel that you can imagine and you can be creative. And creative isn't necessarily making things, it's creative thinking and being and wondering.
Well, all children are intrinsically creative when you watch them play.
That's right.
And use imaginative play.
Yes.
They're creating worlds
That's
and
right.
ideas and characters and stories without anyone
right.
prompting them to do
That's
it.
exactly right.
It's automatic. And some of the others, Robin?
Well, number 5 is making sense is the beginning, middle and end of learning to be literate. So literacy is about meaning making in a whole lot of different ways. There's not one thing that you gain when you learn to read, for example. It's not just a single skill that you have forever. There are a whole lot of different ways that we need to make meaning, and even more so in the 21st century. If I think about the way I learned to read and write, in the dinosaur era, and the huge complexity around so many other forms of literacy now that our children have to make sense of.
And to navigate. And making sense strikes me as also the basis of critical thinking, because I will often listen to something and think, but that doesn't make sense. That doesn't add up to me. And if that doesn't add up to me, I need to investigate this further. I need to get to a point where it does make some sense, or I decide I reject that particular point of view.
And you have to have the confidence to ask the question and to challenge what it is that doesn't seem to make any sense.
And I think you're right about the confidence that you are entitled to expect that something makes sense, and you do not have to accept it until it does.
Exactly.
And that's a life skill, I think.
We don't want to be compliant.
No,
We
or
want-
susceptible to propaganda.
That's right. That's right. And the next one, I guess, we we formed because of the misinformation that has been out there for the last few decades and having a big time again in the media. All children are different, and their experiences are different, their environments are different, their ways of thinking are different, and therefore there is not one size fits all, one way for teaching and learning of reading and writing. So it's about really knowing each child, knowing their needs, and targeting your teaching there.
Well, it always strikes me that that one is very much connected to the first one.
It is.
Because I've always thought to myself, if a child is dealing with a chaotic, incredibly stressful, difficult environment in their home life, the amount of energy and space they have for learning is much less than that for a child who is coming from a more comfortable, more calm, less stressful environment. And yet we never seem to take this. I mean, I know individual teachers do and individual schools do, but if you're looking at our attitudes to education in a more macro way, the way we look at it as a society, the way sometimes policymakers appear to look at it, we never take that into account. The children have different levels of stress in their lives.
Yes, and that affects the way they learn. Certainly can block their learning for some time.
And we know, for example, that neuroscience is now discovering the effects that the stress hormone has on the developing brain, and the fact that it can actually do things like lower IQ.
Yes. And it also can get in the way if you're malnourished.
Yes, of course.
And there are so many
Well, if you're
children...
hungry, who wants to be thinking about maths, timetables, or, I'm terribly sorry to say so, the sounds of A, E, I, O, U.
Yes, and there are 1 in 6 children living in poverty in Australia, as we know, and there are so many children, Food Bank tells us, who go to school at least one day a week with no breakfast and sometimes no food for the whole day.
I remember seeing an incredible, it was from New Zealand, and it was an incredible little film about what the children in a middle class school had in their lunch, in their bags for lunch, and what the children in a very disadvantaged school had in their bags for lunch. And really, they almost had nothing. All the middle class kids had something, and most of it reasonably healthy, not fabulous, but not bad. The working class kids or the disadvantaged kids, they might have a packet of chips if they were lucky.
And the other thing that I think of, Jane, is that people can fall into the trap, the well-intentioned idea that these children have missed out on something. So yes, we'll give them the breakfast, we'll give them the lunch. Schools do that well, but then they don't give them the rich curriculum.
Yes.
They give them the really pared back, basic, simple, and that's not what these children need any more than any other child. They need rich quality literature, rich experiences with language, and yes, they need to make sure they've had the breakfast and the lunch. But what I find is a real equity issue is with children who look like they're falling behind are given something of a much less quality than the children who aren't falling behind. Now that is just widening that equity gap. And we know equity is not about being equal. It's about looking at what that child needs and giving it to them. So that I used to often say to parents and teachers and even children when you're trying to understand, equity and equal. I said, if everybody wore glasses, do they need them? No, the kids would say. Well, it's exactly the same. Not everyone needs, I need to wear glasses. You obviously don't.
I do when I'm reading.
Okay, but we really need to look at the individual. What is it the individual
Yes, that's
needs?
right.
But we need to make sure that we're not giving a dumbed down, pared back, basic to those children who actually need more. They need more of the quality literature, more of the rich language experiences, more of those supports. And schools can do that, and policymakers can support that to happen.
Well, I mean, we've seen the results recently of a very pared back curriculum that was offered to Indigenous children and was touted as a great solution, and it's had no positive effect at all and may even have had a detrimental one. And that's the problem with a magic fix, isn't it?
It is. There isn't a recipe. Some of those children may not have really had any rich literature in their home.
No.
And the research tells us that that's a huge indicator. Having quality literature, a range of books in the home, makes a real difference in terms of understanding what literacy is in the first place.
Well, also, if you have parents for whom literacy has been a struggle and who indeed may not have confidence in their own literacy, who don't read for pleasure, for example, then that example is not there. It's the kind of, it's not just chaotic, stressful, it's also cultural capital, isn't
Yes,
it?
it
It's what they bring through the door.
Yes, that's right. And if parents are stressed and they're trying to hold down a number of jobs or get a job, they're not necessarily in a position to take the time to have a rich storytelling time together, to engage in the kind of questioning and answering the questioning, because every child asks why thousands of times. So they often need, a high quality preschool and early childhood context where those kind of things are emphasised. Whereas a child who's had all of those in their home is going to need different things to continue to further their literacy development.
Because also we mustn't make the mistake of thinking that it's always children from less well-off families that struggle with reading and children from well-off families always breeze through. That's not true either.
No, not at all. And some of it is about actually realising that the time for talk and storytelling is really important, and there's some very well advantaged children who don't necessarily have that time from their parents or caregivers either.
Exactly, and of course Indigenous communities have a very strong storytelling, oral culture, dreamtime stories, all that kind of thing, which would give an enormous underpinning, which other kids miss out on as well.
Yes.
And that needs to be valued. That know, it's everything that a child brings to school needs to be valued and built upon, and that's something that I think we can all focus a lot more on. What are the different ways of being and thinking and storytelling and community identities that these children are bringing to school, and how can we build on them?
So it's more about the approach fitting the child, not the child having to fit the approach.
And I say our schools have to fit our children don't have to fit our schools.
Yeah.
And children need to be able to see themselves in the books that they're reading and sharing together. And children who come to school with other languages other than English need to be encouraged in their own language. They may not necessarily often have those opportunities in a school situation, and that's really important as well. And their parents need to encourage them around their own cultural identity. And sometimes the selection that we make of literature means that children don't necessarily see themselves in that.
And really
literature.
now, because looking at the literature that's available to Australian families and children in schools, there is so much where each child can see themselves in that book, because my skin colour's in that book, my food is in that book, the way my nanny dresses is in that book, or my nonna, and then they think that reaffirms who I am. And the identity every child will be a stronger learner when their identity is affirmed.
This is slightly off the topic, but I just have to throw it in there. That's why I was so impressed with Gina Davis doing that Media Children's Institute research, where she discovered that almost all children's films focus on a male protagonist and very rarely female. For example, Finding Nemo, there's one female fish in the entire ocean and she can't remember her name from one minute to the next. So it's, that's another thing I think that has improved vastly in children's books, that we are now asking boys to identify with girls as well as girls always having to identify with boys. It's nice to see that change. This battered old feminist is keen on that.
It's very important.
It is, and also to be able to identify with people from different cultural backgrounds, because it's not only that you want the child to see themselves, but the child to see that it's possible to be a different kind of person and still be someone you can imaginatively engage with.
And we've got a part of our website, Jane, that we're growing called School Success Stories, where these 11 touchstones, when we know of a school that's really demonstrating 1, 2, 3, 4, all of them, we help them tell their story. And some of the schools that we are able to work on telling their story are telling that story of working with families who have got a really rich cultural breadth in the school, bringing that in. What does that look like? And we've got, the website also has some resources for parents and carers as well as for teachers, so that they can, every parent thinks that books in my home language are important, are worth having. And schools in some communities, as we were saying before, some of those families may not have the time or the money or the way to get books in other languages into their home. Schools can do that, and to have that in there and have, reading aloud time in different languages. And children can go, oh, that's what it sounds like in Vietnamese, that's what it sounds like in Polish, or whatever language it might be, and to see the same book, The Very Hungry Caterpillar, it's in 20 plus languages. Well, school libraries need to have as many of those copies of those books there, so that children go, look what it's like.
And controversially, now we're having children's books where there are 2 mummies or 2
That's
daddies,
exactly
or
right.
very different kinds of families.
They need to see themselves in the literature, in the classroom, in the language experiences.
But you're also broadening the idea, and I think this is what some people object to. I think it's great, but there you go, polarisation again. You also need to see that there is a very wide range of normal. It's expanding what normal is, so that it's not that narrow. When I went to school in the early 60s, it was fun with Dick and Jane, and Dick did all the running and Jane did all the following. Not anymore. Not anymore. Not this Jane, anyway.
No.
I think it's really fantastic. And before we finish up this interview, I do want to ask you about Touchstone 11. I know we haven't got time to go through them all. What's Touchstone 11?
Well, it's a really important one. When parents and carers read to and with their children, everyone benefits. So it's not just about children reading to their parents at whatever stage they're at. It's about parents, children, caregivers, older siblings reading together, sharing together, storying together. And that's building up a rich understanding. It's also building up on a rich relationship. And that's so important.
I read my early teen daughters, the 3 of us sitting down together in the evenings, Jane Eyre out loud.
Wow.
I read it out loud because I knew that it was too dense and too descriptive for them at that stage, but I really wanted them to enjoy it as much as I did. And it's some of the nicest memories I've got is reading that book. We read a few other books. I read them aloud when the girls could have read them easily themselves, but there was just something lovely about that.
And I think too, just building on that, the role that teachers and schools can play is to invite families into the school and model that so that everybody sees that that's important. And then those families who are trying so hard to do the right thing by their child and thinking, oh, we've got to put them into tutoring, they've got to do this program, they've got to do in this way, lockstep, can come in and actually see the school modelling those family reading relationships and see the joy in it and the benefits.
You're
for
learning
everyone.
without even realising you're learning, and
right.
that's the best way to learn.
And and it values that partnership, which education is between the families and the school.
Well, congratulations on the foundation of the foundation for learning and literacy, and thank you for a wonderful, rich and interesting conversation.
Thank you,
Thank
Jane.
you, Jane.
Very generous.
Yes.